All right, welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're diving into something really unique and fascinating. We're talking about the Korean language,
Specifically the writing system.
yeah, and its writing system, Hangul.
Hangeul, yeah.
And it's more than just a way to like write stuff down, right? It's really a window into Korean culture and its history and the people.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of a uniquely logical approach to language. And I think what's fascinating about Hangul is unlike a lot of writing systems, which evolved organically, this one was actually intentionally designed.
Mm.
So, in the 15th century, King Sejong the Great, spearheaded its creation as a featural alphabet, which basically means that the shapes of the letters themselves give you clues about how they sound,
Hmm.
which is, pretty intuitive design.
Right. And like when you see Korean writing, it has this very distinct look to it. It looks very elegant. And like you said, because it wasn't just something that people just kind of randomly put together.
Right.
It was very specifically engineered to be logical.
Right. Yeah.
So you might be wondering, okay, what makes this writing system so special? And why is the Korean language, and we're talking about Korean as it's written in this script, why is it gaining so much attention all over the world?
Right. And that really raises this really fundamental question about how a writing system can empower a people, and how it shapes their identity on a national scale.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, what we want to do is really try to uncover like the power of Hangul,
Hmm.
understand its really pivotal role in Korean history and culture,
Yeah.
and explore kind of the characteristics of the Korean language itself and see why is it resonating with so many people around the globe? Why are so many people interested in learning this language?
Right. Okay, so to start off with, let's kind of unpack the blueprint of Hangul. Like, how does this writing system actually work?
Okay.
So we got to go back in
We
time,
got to go back in time.
back to the 1400s.
1443.
Yeah.
King Sejong, working with this team of scholars, really brilliant minds,
Mm.
came up with Hangul, right? And this isn't just a random assortment of symbols.
Right.
This is like a meticulously planned system
Yeah.
with 24 core letters,
Wow.
14 consonants, 10 vowels.
Okay.
And what's really innovative, I think, is the thinking behind the design. So the shapes of the consonants,
Yeah.
they're not arbitrary,
Mm.
right? It's rooted in articulatory phonetics. So think about when you make a sound, what's happening with your tongue and your mouth. The consonant shapes actually kind of mimic that physical action,
Wow.
right? So for example, let's take the sound haga.
Okay.
Its form is supposed to resemble like the way your tongue touches the roof of your mouth
Oh, interesting.
when you pronounce it. So it's a very visual link between the symbol and the actual act of speaking.
That's such an incredible level of thought put into it.
Right.
It's like the alphabet is giving you the cheat sheet on how to pronounce it.
Exactly.
And the vowels also they're not just like lines and dots.
Yeah. No, they're not random either. The vowels are actually inspired by core philosophical concepts.
Mm.
So you've got a dot, which represents heaven, a horizontal line, which represents earth, and a vertical line, which represents humanity.
Wow.
So it's like this beautiful kind of synthesis of, linguistic principles, philosophy and cosmological views. It's really pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it really is. Now before Hangul came along, the writing system that they were using in Korea was based on classical Chinese characters,
Right.
Hanja.
Right. Hanja.
And that presented kind of a huge challenge for people who wanted to learn to read and write.
Oh, absolutely. It was a massive barrier to literacy
Mhm.
because, Hanja is incredibly complex. You have literally thousands of characters, each representing a word or an idea.
Mhm.
So obviously this restricted literacy to the elite, basically,
Right.
the people who had the time and the resources to study it.
So it sounds kind of like Latin almost,
Yeah.
like back in the day,
Right.
where you had to be, in the upper class to be able to study that.
Exactly.
So, but King Sejong had a different vision. He wanted to empower everyday people.
That was the whole point.
Yeah.
The whole point.
And he wanted to create a writing system that would be so straightforward that anyone could learn it
Yeah.
relatively easily.
Relatively easily.
And there's this saying, isn't there, that like a wise person could learn Hangul in a morning.
Yeah, that's the popular saying, yeah.
Wow. That really speaks to the accessibility that they were going for.
Absolutely.
And, I think about, English. I mean, English, we've got all kinds of silent letters, right? And weird spellings that don't make any sense. But Hangul's phonetic for
Yep.
the most part.
It is, yeah. It operates on a very phonetic basis. So the way a word is written, generally is how it's pronounced.
Mm.
And that makes it so much easier, especially for language learners. Right. To pick. And the other thing is the way the letters are combined, it's like these neat little syllabic blocks. Like,
Yeah.
ooh, that's how you write Hangul, right?
Right.
So not only is it phonetic, but it's also really visually appealing. And it's very efficient in terms of space. So each block is kind of like its own, encapsulates a single unit of sound.
Yeah, it's like a beautiful like Lego set for language.
It is.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
And it's not just us talking about how, Hangul is so, incredible for literacy. I mean, it's recognized around the world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization,
Right.
they have something called the King Sejong Literacy Prize, which is specifically meant to kind of acknowledge Hangul's huge role in promoting literacy. And this prize is awarded every year. It's given to individuals or organizations who are doing really outstanding work, to fight illiteracy.
Wow, that's great.
Around the world. And Hangul's simplicity, its inherent simplicity has made it really popular among language learners globally.
Right. So we've talked about how Hangul is just this, this user-friendly and efficient system.
Right.
But it's really embedded in Korean history.
Absolutely.
It's a part of their identity.
Absolutely.
So let's dig into that a little bit.
Okay,
So King Sejong, who was often referred to as Sejong the Great.
Sejong the Great, yeah.
He wasn't just, a king who had this hobby of, linguistics, right?
No, he was a real visionary.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a true visionary, leader of the Joseon dynasty. And he understood that, education and cultural development were just so vital for the strength of his kingdom, for the prosperity of the people. And his driving force behind Hangul was this deep desire to empower his people. He felt that by giving people the ability to read and write, in their own language, that he could unlock their potential and move away from the exclusivity of, Hanja.
Yeah, yeah. And it wasn't just him by himself working on this, right? He had a team, didn't he?
He did. He collaborated with this amazing group of scholars from the Hall of Worthies, which was like this royal research institute.
Right.
But even though he was working with them, historical records show that King Sejong himself played a really huge role in the kind of conceptualization and the design principles of Hangul. And so the culmination of all this effort was that in 1446, they officially introduced the alphabet to the public.
Wow.
And they did this with the publication of Hangeul, which means the proper sounds for the instruction of the people.
Wow.
And this document basically laid out the fundamental principles, like how does Hangul work, what are the design principles, the featural alphabet, how it's based on phonetics, the philosophical underpinnings. They laid it all out in this document.
So here they are. They're rolling out this brand new writing system.
Yeah.
It's groundbreaking.
Right.
But I would imagine that, there's some pushback.
Oh, yeah.
Especially from the scholars.
Of course.
Who had spent, years learning the old system.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Initially, Hangul met with a lot of resistance. And it was mainly from the educated elite.
Yeah.
Who, they had invested so much in learning Hanja.
Right.
And they saw Hangul as this kind of like too simple. And they even dismissed it as women's script or children's script, which, if you think about it, it really says something about kind of the social hierarchies of the time.
Right.
And how much prestige was attached to being literate in Hanja.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting how, literacy and the ability to read and write became kind of like a class thing.
Absolutely.
Almost like a, way to separate people.
Absolutely. A way to keep power.
Yeah. But that initial opposition, that didn't win, did it? Like, how did Hangul end up becoming so widely accepted?
So it was gradual. It happened over centuries, right? But I think what really solidified Hangul's significance was the period of Japanese colonization from 1910 to 1945. So during this time, the Japanese authorities, they really tried to suppress Korean culture.
Right.
And one of the ways they did this was by banning Hangul.
Yeah.
In schools and in public life. They were really trying to eradicate the language.
That's kind of like, I mean, it sounds like a direct attack on like their identity almost.
It was. It absolutely was. But by doing that, it actually had the opposite effect.
Hmm.
It transformed Hangul into this powerful symbol of national resistance and pride.
Hmm.
Right. So during this really dark period, you had all these underground Hangul schools popping up.
Wow.
And Koreans would risk, punishment to preserve their language
Hmm.
and to preserve their writing system.
Hmm.
And so that really cemented Hangul's place as an emblem
Yeah.
of the Korean spirit.
It's incredible, like the resilience
Yeah.
of, a language.
Of a people.
Yeah, and the writing system.
Right.
In the face of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when Korea was finally liberated in 1945, it only makes sense that Hangul became the official script.
Of course, it became the official script of both North and South Korea.
Yeah.
And it was a way of kind of reinforcing that shared national identity
Yeah.
and that sense of independence that they fought so hard for. And to this day, both countries celebrate Hangul Day, which is, in South Korea, it's October 9th.
Okay.
And in North Korea, it's January 15th. And, these are big national holidays
Right.
where they commemorate the creation of Hangul and its lasting significance.
Yeah, yeah. So what about Hanja today? Is it still being used at all in Korea?
So its use has really declined, especially in North Korea. They've completely stopped using Hanja altogether.
Okay.
In South Korea, you might still see some Chinese characters, like maybe if you're reading an older newspaper, or some academic texts.
Right.
Or if you're trying to clarify the etymology of a word, like where the word came from. But day-to-day usage, not really. Hangul is definitely the, primary writing system.
So we've delved into Hangul, this amazing writing system,
Yeah.
but let's actually talk about the Korean language itself.
Okay.
Spoken Korean.
Yeah.
Where does it fit in
Okay.
with all the other languages around the world?
So that's actually really fascinating
Yeah.
because Korean is what they call a language isolate, which means that linguists haven't been able to find a definitive, genetic relationship between Korean
Yeah.
and any of the other major language families.
Wow.
So there's been some theories, some people say that it might be connected to the Altaic family, which includes Turkish, Mongolian.
Right.
Some people even say maybe there's a connection to the Japonic languages like Japanese.
Mm.
But those connections are debated, and there isn't super strong evidence to support them. So for now, it's kind of like this linguistic island.
Wow. So it's kind of like it went on its own evolutionary path.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's evolved some really interesting features. So one of the most notable is its grammar.
Okay.
It has this agglutinative structure. So think of it like building blocks.
Yeah.
You're taking suffixes, you're adding them on to the root of a word to indicate different grammatical functions like tense, case, politeness level, things like that.
Yeah.
And generally, Korean sentences follow a subject-object-verb-word order, which is different from English. English is subject-verb-object.
Right.
So, for example, in English, you might say, I eat rice.
Yeah.
But in Korean, you would say, I rice eat.
Wow.
Something along those lines.
Okay, so you really have to think differently about how you're putting your sentences together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you're an English speaker, what are some other key features of the spoken language?
So another really crucial aspect of Korean is its honorifics.
Okay.
So politeness, acknowledging social hierarchy is super important in Korean culture.
Right. I've heard about that.
And it's reflected in the language itself. So there are all these different speech levels, right? You have verb endings. You even have specific vocabulary that you use depending on who you're talking to, right? Like their age, their social standing, your level of familiarity with them. So imagine the way you would greet a close friend.
Yeah.
Is going to be very different from how you would formally address a senior colleague at work or a stranger.
Right.
So you really have to pay attention to the context, the social context of this situation.
Yeah. So it's not just about the words themselves. It's the way you're saying things, the words you're choosing. It's all very important.
It's all very important.
What about the sounds of the language itself? Does Korean have any kind of sounds that make it unique?
Yeah, so the Korean sound system is really interesting. It's got some unique characteristics. One is that it has what we call aspirated consonants. So these are sounds where you produce them with this puff of air,
Yeah.
right? And that makes them different from unaspirated consonants.
Right.
So, that's maybe getting a little deep into the phonetics, but those kinds of things really contribute to the unique sound of the Korean language.
Yeah, yeah. So where do Korean words, like where do they come from?
So the vocabulary of Korean, it's really interesting because it's like it draws on different sources. So obviously there's a core of native Korean words, right? Words that have always been there.
Right.
But because of Korea's long history of interacting with China, there's this huge layer of Sino-Korean vocabulary. Words that are originally from Chinese but have been adapted into Korean. And then in recent times, especially with, South Korea's kind of really rapidly globalizing society,
Yeah.
there's been a big influx of English loan words, especially in areas like technology,
Right.
pop culture, fashion,
Yeah, yeah.
And it's interesting because in North Korea, they've actually done like the opposite. They've tried to kind of keep the language more pure. So they've coined a lot of new Korean terms to replace those foreign loan words. So there's actually a growing difference in the vocabulary
Wow.
between North and South Korea.
So it's almost like two branches of the same language that are kind of going on different paths
In a way, yeah, absolutely.
because of the political and cultural influences.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier some ways that Korean is different from other languages.
Yeah.
Can we dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So, as we said, unlike English, Hangul doesn't have any silent letters.
Right.
So spelling and pronunciation are pretty, straightforward. Japanese also uses phonetic scripts like hiragana and katakana, which together are called kana. But Hangul's unique because of those syllabic blocks.
Right.
The way they organize the consonants and vowels. And then, in contrast to Chinese, which uses characters that represent meaning.
Right.
Hangul is alphabetical. It's
Yeah.
representing sounds. And grammatically, Korean does have some things in common with Japanese, like the subject-object-verb order,
Right.
and using particles to mark grammatical functions. But despite those similarities, they're not considered to be like directly related languages.
Interesting. So it's kind of like got, like some of these unique aspects,
Yeah.
but then it also kind of touches on other languages as well.
Right. Right. It's this interesting mix.
Now, I remember reading something about how there were attempts to actually introduce Hangul as a writing system for other languages.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really interesting, although not super successful, part of Hangul's history. So you had these Korean linguistic groups who were really trying to promote Hangul as a potential writing system for languages that didn't have writing systems or for languages that were kind of underserved.
Right.
And there was a big project in Indonesia, actually, with a language called Czechia. And it was really driven by this like admiration for how accurate Hangul is phonetically.
Right.
And they wanted to contribute to global literacy. And their thinking was because Hangul is so systematic, at representing sounds, it could be adapted to pretty much any spoken language.
So it's kind of like this ambition to, take what they had created
Right.
and share it with the world
Exactly.
and try to improve literacy around the world.
Exactly.
What happened with those attempts?
So while it was very well intentioned and some communities did adopt it, they experimented with it, it didn't really result in like widespread lasting use of Hangul for other languages.
Right.
And that makes sense because adopting a writing system is really complex.
Yeah.
It's not just about the linguistics, it's also about the culture, the history, politics are involved.
Right.
And you need the community to be on board.
Yeah.
You need long-term support.
Right.
So it's a really big endeavor.
Yeah. It makes sense that it wasn't quite as successful as they had hoped.
Yeah.
So let's change gears a little bit here.
Okay.
We've talked about Korean and we've talked about Hangul. But what about English? What role does English play in South Korea today?
So English plays a huge role in modern South Korea. I mean, it's become this like crucial factor for social mobility
Right.
and economic mobility. People see it as the key to getting better education and jobs.
So it's kind of like a requirement almost
It is in many ways, yeah.
to get ahead.
And, while it's not a perfect parallel, you could almost compare it to, during the Japanese colonization, how important it was to know Japanese
Right.
if you wanted to get ahead. These days, English is everywhere. It's on signs, it's in advertising, it's all over pop culture.
Yeah.
And if you want a good white-collar job,
Yeah.
A lot of times you need to be proficient in English,
Mm.
even if you're not necessarily using it directly.
So it's kind of become like another kind of gatekeeper?
In some ways, you could definitely argue that, yeah.
Hmm. That's interesting.
And this has led to this phenomenon called Konglish.
Gonglish.
Yeah, I've heard of this.
Yeah, so it's basically, taking English words and phrases,
Right.
adapting them,
Yeah.
and often like romanizing them, but using Hangul. And it's everywhere in South Korea,
Mm.
especially in things like, fashion,
Right.
technology, everyday, like consumer products.
Yeah.
It's this really fascinating blend. Yeah, it's like they're constantly like negotiating almost
Right.
between English and Korean.
Right. Exactly.
We were talking before about how, North and South Korean, their vocabulary is starting to, change,
Right.
become different from one another.
Right.
Has that caused any problems?
Yeah, it has actually. So as North and South Korea, they've grown further apart politically and socially.
Right.
Communication has become trickier,
Hmm.
especially when it comes to like technical terms, newly coined terms. So you have a lot of North Korean defectors,
Right.
and sometimes it can be hard for them to communicate
Right.
with South Koreans. So they've actually had to develop special translation apps
Wow.
to try to bridge this gap,
Wow. That's fascinating.
which is just this, real reminder of how language changes in response to, the society that it's in.
Yeah, it really shows how dynamic language is. It's not
Yeah.
just, this static thing.
Right. It's always evolving and being shaped by, all these forces.
Exactly, by culture, by politics, by, all these different things.
So I guess to bring it all back around, I mean, Hangul is really so much more than just an alphabet, right?
It's so much more. It's a scientific invention
Yeah.
that represents like Korean history, the brilliance of the people who created it, the resilience of the Korean people.
It's really been amazing to kind of trace its journey from, its deliberate creation to, overcome literacy barriers to
Yeah.
being this, powerful symbol of national identity
Mm,
during a time of struggle. And now it's gaining global recognition.
right,
And all while, the Korean language itself is continuing to evolve.
right.
It really makes you think about the connection between a writing system
Mm.
and a nation's culture
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a powerful connection.
and their place in the world. Yeah. This deep dive into Hangul and the Korean language really does leave us with a big question,
Mm.
How does a writing system not only, allow people to communicate,
Mm.
but really deeply shape a nation's identity,
Mm.
its heritage, and how it's viewed on the world stage? It's a remarkable story, and it's a story that's still being written.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have today for the deep dives. Thanks for joining us.